The Aztec Empire, a place where thousands of people were sacrificed every year just to keep the sun rising. Back in the mid-1400s, the Aztecs took over central Mexico and built a world that revolved around power and fear. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, had something like 200,000 people, huge for that era, even bigger than Paris. They expanded through war, demanded heavy tribute, and divided society into strict layers: nobles, warriors, merchants, peasants, and slaves, and over all of it was religion. They genuinely believed the gods needed human blood, or the universe would collapse. If the sun stopped rising, it was their fault. The numbers are debated, but many say the Aztecs sacrificed around 20,000 people a year. Some claim far more. During the big rededication of their main temple in the late 1400s, there were stories of tens of thousands being killed in just a few days, hearts torn out, bodies rolling down the steps. They even fought flower wars, battles designed not for territory, but to capture prisoners for sacrifice. Conquered cities had to send humans as tribute, and the skull racks, the tzompantli, held rows of heads, thousands of them. But here's the twist. The Spanish exaggerated a lot. They needed a reason to justify conquest, so they made the Aztecs look even more brutal. Modern historians usually lower the estimates, maybe a few million deaths spread across a century, counting both wars and sacrifices. Still horrific, but not the industrial-scale slaughter the Spanish loved to describe. The Assyrian Empire, the people who basically pioneered psychological warfare, and they made sure everyone knew it through the brutal scenes carved into their own palace walls. This empire ruled Mesopotamia for thousands of years, really hitting its peak in the later centuries of its history. Nineveh, in what's now northern Iraq, was their heart. They became the world's first true military superpower. They brought in heavy cavalry, massive battering rams, towering siege machines, and early versions of coordinated battlefield tactics. But their real signature was fear. Assyrian kings openly showcased their cruelty as a form of propaganda. They impaled thousands of prisoners on stakes around conquered cities, leaving them to die slowly as a warning. They flayed rebel leaders alive, stuffed their skins with straw, and displayed them like trophies. Entire communities were mutilated, hands, feet, noses, ears cut off. One king, Ashurnasirpal II, even bragged about building a pillar out of living and dead heads. And then there were the mass deportations. Around 4 million people were forced to relocate. Still, the exact death toll is hard to pin down. Across generations of conquest, forced marches, executions, and psychological terror, historians estimate somewhere between 5 and 10 million lives lost. And considering the world population back then, maybe 50 to 100 million, that scale was enormous. The Assyrians proved something grim. Terror can work in the short run, but universally hated empires crumble fast once they weaken. Eventually, a coalition of Babylonians and Medes wiped out Nineveh in the early 600s BC. The Timurid Empire, a place where Tamerlane marked his victories by building pyramids made from tens of thousands of human skulls. Tamerlane, or Timur, was a Turco-Mongol warlord who carved a path of conquest from the streets of Delhi to the outskirts of Moscow in the late 1300s and early 1400s. He claimed lineage from Genghis Khan. Operating from Samarkand in what's now Uzbekistan, he launched campaign after campaign across Central Asia, Persia, India, Anatolia, and Russia. His 100,000-strong cavalry fought with classic Mongol speed, deadly composite bows, and pure psychological terror. But in terms of cruelty, Tamerlane went even further than the Mongols ever did. He didn't just conquer cities, he erased them. In Isfahan, in Persia, around 70,000 people were beheaded, their skulls arranged in towering pyramids. In Delhi, he ordered the execution of roughly 100,000 prisoners before the battle even began, and then killed another 100,000 civilians afterward. In Baghdad, almost 90,000 died, again with a pyramid of skulls as a grim monument. Aleppo saw around 20,000 beheaded. Damascus, Smyrna, Ankara, the same story repeated. Around 5% of the world's population at the time, nearly 17 million out of roughly 300 million, died during his campaigns. But the empire he built unraveled the moment he was gone. With no strong central structure, it splintered among sons and generals. It left behind almost no lasting institutions, only widespread trauma. Ironically, his own descendants would later found the Mughal Empire in India, ruling with far more tolerance, a complete contrast to Tamerlane's brutality. The Nazi regime. The only one on this list that turned genocide into an industrial process, complete with gas chambers and extermination camps. The Third Reich lasted from the early 1930s to the mid-1940s under Adolf Hitler. Its entire worldview was built on a pseudo-scientific racial fantasy. Aryans at the top, everyone else considered inferior or subhuman. The extermination of entire peoples wasn't improvised, it was planned. The so-called final solution was formalized in a meeting that lasted barely an hour and a half at Wannsee. What followed were literal death factories, places like Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. Gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. Zyklon B dropped from vents. Industrial crematoria. Medical experiments that crossed every imaginable line. Under this machine, about 6 million Jews were murdered. The Holocaust. Another 7 to 10 million Soviet civilians died under an intentional starvation plan. About 3 million Soviet prisoners of war were left to die. Nearly 2 million non-Jewish Poles were killed. In total, somewhere between 17 and 20 million civilians were deliberately murdered in just over a decade. What makes the Holocaust historically distinct is its nature. Industrial, bureaucratic, recorded genocide. The Nazis documented everything. Transport lists, camp logs, execution numbers. We know the names of millions of the victims because the killers preserved the records. Unlike ancient empires, where numbers are blurry estimates, the Nazi atrocities were counted by the perpetrators themselves. And after it ended, the Nuremberg trials created the legal concept of crimes against humanity. The Soviet Union under Stalin. Stalin ruled the USSR from the mid-1920s to the early 1950s. He forced agriculture into collectivized farms, pushed breakneck industrialization, and unleashed massive political purges, ethnic deportations, and a sprawling gulag system of forced labor camps. The entire structure ran on fear. Regions were given arrest quotas. Confessions were extracted through torture. Executions could be instantaneous. The NKVD, the secret police, arrested millions. Even families of traitors were punished. Guilt by association. Then came the Holodomor in the early 1930s, a man-made famine in Ukraine that killed somewhere between 3 and 5 million people. Stalin seized grain, blocked outside aid, and outlawed attempts to flee. Ukrainians were reduced to eating bark, weeds, and anything they could find. Some, in utter desperation, turned to cannibalism. During the Great Purge in the late 1930s, around 700,000 people were executed, and roughly 1.5 million more were sent to the gulags. Ethnic groups like the Crimean Tatars, Chechens, and Soviet Koreans were deported en masse. About 2 to 3 million people uprooted, with hundreds of thousands dying on the way. Across the entire gulag system, about 18 million people passed through the camps, and well over 1 million never survived. All told, roughly 20 to 25 million deaths are attributed directly to Stalin's rule, from famine, executions, forced labor, and deportations. The numbers are debated. Some Russian scholars claim around 9 million. Some Western estimates climb towards 60 million, if indirect deaths are included. But the mainstream academic consensus settles in the 20 to 25 million range. The Spanish Empire. The Spanish Empire in the Americas stretched from the late 1400s to the late 1800s, conquering everything from Mexico down to Argentina. Conquistadors like Cortés and Pizarro toppled the Aztec and Inca empires, with only a few hundred men facing millions. Their advantages were enormous. Horses, firearms, epidemic diseases, and alliances with local groups who had long been oppressed by those empires. Under the encomienda system, indigenous people were effectively turned into slaves. Catholic missions enforced conversion, and the silver mines of Potosi worked through the Maita, a system of forced labor, killed around 8 million people over the course of a few centuries. Before Europeans arrived, the population of the Americas was somewhere between 50 and 100 million. By around the early 1600s, it had fallen to 5 to 10 million, a collapse of roughly 90%. The The causes were layered: European diseases like smallpox, measles, and typhus, responsible for more than half the deaths, along with massacres during conquest, brutal labor systems in mines and plantations, famine brought by the destruction of indigenous agriculture, and complete social breakdown. Many Spaniards considered the natives subhuman. The famous Valladolid debate in the mid-1500s even questioned whether indigenous people had souls. Still, putting all the blame solely on Spanish cruelty oversimplifies the tragedy. Most victims died from diseases that spread unintentionally through the Columbian Exchange, but the Spanish had already devastated communities with extreme brutality. Friar Bartolomé de las Casas recorded horrors: people burned alive, infants thrown to dogs, populations worked to death. The exact toll is unknowable, but historians often estimate 8 to 15 million deaths directly caused by Spanish policies and systems. The Congo Free State. From the mid-1880s to the early 1900s, the Congo Free State belonged directly to King Leopold II of Belgium. He persuaded Europe that he would bring civilization to Central Africa. In reality, he ran a brutal rubber extraction system built on terror. His private militia, the Force Publique, forced villages to meet impossible quotas. When they failed, the punishment was amputation. Soldiers were required to prove they hadn't wasted ammunition, so they brought back severed hands as receipts. The death toll is staggering. Somewhere between 10 and 15 million people, roughly half the population, died. Causes ranged from executions to starvation, because entire communities were forced to gather rubber instead of farming. Diseases like sleeping sickness spread unchecked and killed millions. Slave labor exhausted countless others. Birth rates collapsed, since women were held in labor camps and families were torn apart. Photos of children with missing hands shocked the Western world. Activists like Edmund Morel and Roger Casement documented the horrors and exposed them internationally. Under enormous pressure, Leopold finally handed the territory over to the Belgian government in 1908, but he himself was never held accountable. He died wealthy the following year, after destroying most of his personal archives to cover his tracks. Belgium took nearly a century to openly acknowledge the atrocities, and the Congo still suffers the consequences. The Qing Dynasty during the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion in the mid-1800s erupted when Hong Xiuquan, a man who believed he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, launched a massive revolt against the Qing dynasty. He created the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom in southern China, with Nanjing as its capital. His movement promoted a highly unorthodox form of Christianity, abolished private property, and pushed radical gender equality. The Qing responded by mobilizing imperial armies and powerful regional militias. What followed was a 14-year war that tore apart some of China's wealthiest heartlands. The rebellion killed an estimated 20 to 30 million people, making it the largest conflict of the 19th century. Some battles involved hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The siege of Nanjing dragged on for years, but most deaths didn't come from combat. Starvation and disease swept through the countryside as farms were burned. The economy collapsed, and millions fled as refugees. The Taipings massacred anyone they called demon followers, often Confucians. The Qing massacred rebels. Both sides burned entire cities, poisoned wells, and executed captives. Whole provinces were left nearly empty. The numbers, though, are still just estimates. Chinese records from that era are incomplete. What we do know is that China's population fell from about 410 million in the early 1850s to around 350 million by the early 1870s, a drop of 60 million. Not all of that was caused by the Taiping Rebellion. Other uprisings like the Nian, Panthay, and Dungan rebellions happened at the same time. Mao's Great Leap Forward. In the late 1950s and early 1960s was Mao Zedong's push to turn agrarian China into an industrial powerhouse almost overnight. Agriculture was forcibly collectivized into giant communes. Farmers were ordered to melt their own tools in makeshift backyard furnaces to produce steel, most of which ended up being worthless. Peasants abandoned their fields to work on pointless industrial schemes. Local officials inflated harvest numbers to impress the central government, and Beijing seized these imaginary surpluses. The result was famine on a scale the world had never seen. The Great Chinese Famine, from the late 1950s into the early 1960s, killed anywhere between 15 and 55 million people, the widest range of estimates for any human-made catastrophe. The Chinese government hid the truth for decades. People survived by eating bark, clay, anything. Some resorted to cannibalism. Parents traded children so they wouldn't have to eat their own. Mao knew famine was spreading, but continued exporting grain to maintain the nation's image. Those who spoke out were arrested. Doctors who reported starvation were imprisoned. Historians still debate the nature of the disaster, intentional genocide or catastrophic incompetence. Mao didn't set out to create famine, but his policies caused it, and he refused to stop them even as millions died. Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen famously said, "Famines don't happen in democracies. Dictatorships can simply ignore mass death." Modern scholarship generally lands on around 30 to 40 million deaths. The Mongol Empire. From the early 1200s to the late 1300s, the Mongol Empire became the largest land empire ever created, stretching from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia down to Vietnam. It began with Genghis Khan, who united the Mongol tribes and unleashed a wave of conquests across Eurasia. His armies were built on fast-moving cavalry, deadly composite bows, and a terrifyingly calculated use of psychological warfare. The Mongols always offered a choice: surrender and live as tributaries, or resist and face total destruction. At first, many chose to resist until they saw cities turned into pyramids of skulls. Genghis Khan annihilated the Khwarezm Empire in Central Asia, with 1 to 2 million people killed. In Merv, around 700,000 were executed. Chroniclers claimed each Mongol soldier personally killed hundreds. When the Mongols sacked Baghdad in the mid-12th century, between 200,000 and 1 million died, ending the Abbasid Caliphate and shattering the Islamic Golden Age. In China, the Qing Dynasty lost well over half its population during the Mongol conquest. Historians estimate 30 to 40 million people were killed, close to 10% of the global population at the time. Yet the Mongols also created something unexpected: the Pax Mongolica, a period of relative peace across the Silk Road, unprecedented trade and cultural exchange, and a largely uniform legal system stretching across continents. They practiced broad religious tolerance and, after conquering a region, often governed with surprising pragmatism. It's one of history's strangest contradictions. The deadliest military machine of the medieval world produced the most interconnected century of the pre-modern era. The Mongol Empire proved that speed and fear can topple entire civilizations. The British Empire. From the early 1600s to the mid-1900s, the British Empire stretched across a quarter of the planet and ruled over roughly 400 million people. Its power rested on economic extraction, the East India Company, transatlantic slavery, resource exploitation, and the destruction of local industries. Unlike ancient empires that killed through direct slaughter, the British often killed through what historians call structural violence, policies that produced famine, disease, forced labor, and total economic collapse. In India, the Great Bengal famine of the late 1700s killed around 10 million people. The Victorian-era famines of the late 1800s killed another 30 to 60 million. Even as India continued exporting grain to Britain. In the early 1940s, Churchill diverted food from Bengal to military stockpiles, triggering a famine that killed roughly 3 million. In Ireland, the Great Famine of the mid-1800s killed 1 million. A quarter of the population vanished, while Ireland kept exporting food to England. Across Africa, during the Boer Wars, the Mau Mau Uprising, and repeated colonial famines, millions more died. In the Atlantic slave trade, about 12 million people were transported, and around 2 million died during the crossing. Total estimates vary widely, somewhere between 50 and 150 million deaths over 3.5 centuries. The numbers are debated. How much came from deliberate policy? How much from negligence? How much from the broader forces of empire? Historian Mike Davis famously called the Victorian famines Victorian Holocausts, created by rigid free market ideology. British defenders counter that the empire also built railways, introduced education, and established legal systems. The debate continues. But the British Empire showed that capitalist empires can kill through economics as effectively as through warfare. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. See what's next. Tuskegee syphilis experiment. The Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male ran from the early 30s until the early 70s in Alabama.